Hey all, I wanted to talk about the basics of photography before I get too much further ahead in regards to the emotional aspects of photography. For those of you who may know about these things, I also found it helpful to refresh my more technical knowledge despite having previously known about it. So, the four basics of photography when it comes to being camera savvy are ISO, shutter speed, f-stop, and white balance. These things work together, and understanding one isn't nearly as helpful as when you begin to practice them in unison. They each have a correlation effect, and will result in different outcomes as you play and practice in your own photographs. Typically, while shooting in the field on our most commonly used lens, the 24mm, we are shooting at around 1 to 2 to 2.8 f-stop, ISO 400, and 1/160th of a second, or shutter speed. Our white balance differs dependent on light situation, but assuming it's mainly neutral, we will shoot at around 5600 Kelvin. Now let's understand these things a little bit better. F-stop is something most photographers hear, but speaking from first-hand experience, it's not something easily grasped as a term. The f-stop is determined by the focal length of your lens. Focal length is the field of view, basically the scope of information that the camera can take in. The higher your f-stop, the sharper each object in the frame will be, but the darker the shot will also be, naturally. The brighter you shoot with a low number f-stop, say around 1 to 2, then the softer all the objects will be around the subject, or the focal point. So for those blurrier, more movement-oriented photographs, we are shooting with a lower f-stop. A good rule of thumb, the higher the number, the sharper everything in the composed frame is, the lower the number, the sharper one thing in focus is. To simplify shutter speed the best I can, hold up a tightly closed fist to your eye. It's obvious you can't see anything out of that eye now, but as you slowly open your fist to resemble a monocular, more and more light and information is let into your field of view. It works the same with shutter speed. If you open your fist quickly and close it again, you're able to capture movement very quickly, getting in between shots that are otherwise missed. If you leave your fist open for a long amount of time, the more information your eye can take in, understanding everything that is there. This is the same for the camera. The longer you leave the shutter open, the more information it can capture in darker situations, but the objects should mostly be still, otherwise you're left with what's called the long exposure effect. For example, when photographers shoot the starry night sky, they are shooting typically at a higher f-stop and an extremely open shutter, on a tripod mainly. It stays open for up to, say, 30 seconds, taking in all the bits of light that it can, and when a shooting star streaks across the sky, it leaves a line. That's because the camera has plotted and recorded the full movement of the object. In very basic terms, ISO is a camera setting that will brighten or darken your photo. As you increase your ISO number, your photos will grow brighter. For that reason, ISO can help you capture images in darker scenarios. However, raising your ISO also has consequences that affect the overall sharpness and quality of your photo. If you're shooting at too high of an ISO, you will lose a lot of the sharpness in the subject or composition, and instead it will be replaced by what's known as noise or grain. It's a balance. So if you can't brighten a photo using a wider aperture, or if your object is moving and you can't leave your shutter open long, then raising the ISO number is your best bet. White balance is often untalked about in the field, as most people shoot naturally for editing purposes. Ellie and I find a monumental amount of help in choosing our white balance based on the feel or mood we are aiming for as we are shooting. Typically, to make things feel inviting, we will shoot warmer. To give a more emotional or melancholic feel, we will shoot cooler. So white balance is really in reference to temperature and is actually measured as such in Kelvin. The lower the K, the colder or bluer the photo is. The higher the K, the warmer or more yellow it is. You can choose as you'd like, but a good rule for how we shoot is typically a bit warmer at around 5,000 to 6,000 Kelvin. Once you play around with all of these individually, you will begin to get a feel with how they need to be accompanied by the others, as composition, subject, and light are also keys to framing a photograph. ISO, white balance, shutter speed, and f-stop are keys to understand how to actually take a photograph. Without getting too much into the branding aspect of photography, I thought I would talk a little bit more about the styling as well. Styling doesn't need to be done with antiques, and 9 times out of 10, the sort of shoots most people watching this are doing are very different to what we do. However, I just wanted to talk a little bit more about why I think it's important to have branding and styling together when you're actually taking a photograph. The key is consistency. If you want to evoke a mood, whether it's old, earthy, warm, minimalist, etc., then it's your job as the photographer to style the shoot around those things respectively. Think of yourself less like a photographer and more like a composer. You wouldn't create a musical playlist that has death metal and old country songs. Now, you might, but the result may be a bit confusing to the vast majority of your audience. So when I'm styling photographs, flat lays, and even designs, I am working to create a consistency or storyline that is followed so that the audience can look at everything together and feel the connection as opposed to being overwhelmed by a bunch of non-relational stuff. A rule of thumb: if it doesn't help tell your story, don't include it. There is no point to throwing something random into the mix just because you might like it. I mean, you're of course welcome to do that, but the reason that brands like McDonald's and Apple succeed is because they are selling a product that people can consistently rely on. They know at each different location the same level of quality is being delivered. Terrible references, but they're the easiest to understand. It's the same with photographs, clientele, social media, and so forth. If you have a story, tell it in a way that is fluid and consistent. Your audience will grow because they know to expect what you have to offer. This doesn't mean to stifle your creativity and do the same thing over and over, but rather to stay in tune with your foundations. If you want to work with fashion clients, for example, the best thing you can do is to take photographs.
Really beautifully, or just like texture. I often actually have the 100mm on hand, which is just a fixed lens, and this one's awesome for detail. The 100 to 400 is also really good just because you have the access to getting those really tight crops. I'll show you what I'm taking here. So it's basically just a tight crop of a detail, and this is to complement other photos that I'll be taking later on for a set or a series.
Important things I think about when I'm shooting is the linearity of my shot, making sure that it's completely lined up. All I do is make sure that the edges of a rigid line, like a building or a tree, are lined up with the edge of the camera. So if you're shooting in live view mode, you can actually pretty easily see when your shot is vertically up and down or horizontally left to right. The idea is that you create like a really strong centered shot while preserving the hierarchy and the depth of field without line up that shot. So you can see I'm trying to line up the lines here. I want my focus to be the very back of the depth of field of the shot. It's really nice. A lot of our imagery is not like close-up shots that are really impacting, like flowers and things like that. We actually try to make compositions more important. So the composition of a photograph, meaning there's multiple pieces that are going into account when we're thinking about photographing it. It tells a story as opposed to just like a zoom in on like one of these locks or something like that.
So one of my biggest tips in photographing in documentary style places or areas you don't have much control over what you're photographing is just using your headspace that allows you to get as creative as you can. And this is just seeing things in different ways. So instead of seeing something straight on and basic, you can kind of look at it through a reflection, or look at it from the ground, or look at it through the side of a building. And I think just switching up your perspective and using things like your hands to cover part of the lens if you don't want something in the image, and just getting creative. I think there's really no rules on that. So continuing on from what we've said here, we're going to go into our portrait section of the tutorial. So this was also filmed in Paris, and we actually met Caitlin and Leo. Even our videographer for the first day was on that day that we were shooting. So this often happens when we're going into a shoot. Typically there can be a lot going on, you're just meeting these people, and you need to kind of feel that everyone is comfortable and you're gauging what they would be up for to get whatever kind of photos you're after. I think this is a common thing for myself in wedding photography too. So no matter what kind of photography you do, whether it's wedding photography or fashion photography in portraiture, this section could potentially help a lot. The first thing I suggest doing when going into a shooting session is just figuring out what the intent is for the photography shoot, knowing within your head, what is this for? What is the primary thing that I'm shooting? How can I focus on it? Or is it an emotion that you're trying to capture, and what kind of things can I photograph to accent this emotion? But often it works vice versa. So you could be going in and photographing something for somebody, like an outfit or shoes or electronics or whatever it is that you're photographing on somebody, and then figuring out what kind of emotion you want to convey from them, what kind of feeling you want within the shoot to accent that thing. It can also work the other way around. The main reason for your shoot could be you're trying to capture a specific feeling, and then you can use physical objects to kind of bring that into play, which is kind of like what we talked about in the styling section of the tutorial. However, if you're capturing an emotion, I feel like time of day and all of those things can be heavily thought out in order to capture that. So the second thing I've realized lately is planning a shot list when I'm going into shoots helps so much. And I'm not naturally a planner, so I don't gravitate towards lists, but doing this has helped me in so many ways. So you can come into a photo session with a game plan. So when planning, I usually let my brain go as crazy as it needs to go in terms of what kind of perspectives I want to get and what the ideal shots are, involving details like reflection, light, and mood. Even if you don't think that your dream shots are even physically possible, I think it's okay to be an absolute idealist and try and see what falls into place, because in your mind, you're setting a bar. And I think that's kind of important when you're going into a shoot, that you have this bar, and even if you can't, reach the exact shots, you can do things that still have that same emotion. When you do this, you're not going to get lost in so many ideas. You know how sometimes it can be overwhelming, like you just don't know where to begin. You can kind of have, again, that game plan of like, this is what I want to achieve, and you can kind of key out your strategy, I guess, in getting to that point. And it also prevents you from getting lost in the sense of fixating on one idea. I think that's something we can normally do, and just come in with this one idea and have to get it, and it kind of stifles your whole shoot because you're so fixated on this one thing. If you have all those other shots written down, you kind of have, backup plans and other ideas, which can often throw you into doing something completely different, but from that you can get even better ideas. Another thing this does is just gives you freedom in the session. So in your subconscious, you have a nice list of things you can pick at to guide the shoot. And of course, another thing that I think is completely best is having that freedom to keep your options open for collaboration with whoever you're photographing with. Asking the person about themselves, or figuring it out beforehand, getting to know them a bit, so you can photograph them in their own element or doing things kind of true to who they are. This is something I try and do as much as possible, as it keeps the photos timeless and honest. Now, circling back to photographing details, which is what we've been talking about since the beginning of this, just keep your eyes open to the true process of what your subject is doing, the surroundings, the spontaneous moments in the background that perhaps you're not even trying to photograph. Capturing the beauty in the season, summer, autumn, winter, spring, or the time of day and the light, or any little moments that can help tie your photographic story together in a more true and emotional way. Having a different lens on hand can sometimes help to differentiate these shots for impact as well. If you're photographing the portraits on a close-up lens and then you get these grand wide detail shots of the surroundings, or vice versa, you could be photographing the people on a beautiful wide lens and you can get these tight crops of like intense texture or details to complement that. This can often help with making the whole series just intriguing or interesting. Before going into this shoot, I had kind of envisioned a set of like almost energetic photos encapsulating Paris in a way that's quite typical and romantic, as well as just lighthearted, youthful, and fun. And I'd envisioned shots of them like running, with them kind of in focus and the rest moving. And I'd envisioned shots with Caitlin sitting on a sunny bank, actually, using a filter, which is I actually put glad wrap over my lens, or cling wrap, which helps kind of like diffuse the light, and it gives it this glary kind of almost like 40s feeling. And I did envision that shot specifically, so going out and photographing in this particular like harsher light helps that shot as well. And also just capturing like the details by the water, the feeling of being in Paris. And I had a couple of set shots in my mind from inspiration, which were actually old photographs, and I kind of used them as a stepping stone into this shoot, into how I wanted the mood to be driven. And by having those things, I could capture exactly what I wanted and navigate into different other creative areas from that, again, as a stepping stone. And I think having that in place beforehand, before you go and meet someone, especially if you're just meeting them for the first time, can be super helpful, because again, it just helps you navigate where the shoot is going as the photographer. I think it's really important that you take the time to kind of have a vague idea of where you want to head in the shoot. And because things were going to plan and I was incredibly inspired, and that will happen when you're achieving what you set out to do, your brain is almost like unlocked to this other element of creativity where you're looking around as well as shooting, and you're taking photographs of the details. So for me, it was like more close-ups of the outfits and the colors that they were wearing, or the water, or just the light through her hair. And the shoot wasn't about those things, but those things helped the overall agenda of what we're doing.